see, so you've got the carbon tax, and that's a separate thing. Then you've got the carbon farming initiative. So the carbon tax is about liable entities. There's 360 at the moment. There's actually a list on the website you can go through. And how the carbon tax operates is if you produce over 25,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents in a year, you trigger the threshold, you become a liable entity. Now, as a liable entity, you've got three choices. You can reduce your emissions, you can offset them by buying Australian carbon credit units, or you can do your own project and generate them, or you can buy permits from the Australian government. Now, liable entities, agriculture is specifically excluded. The closest you might come to a liable entity is in some of the food processing end of things, so abattoirs. There are a few abattoirs that actually trigger the threshold and are liable entities. And like dairy product manufacturers, you know, the processing type end of it. What they've done is they've looked at it and said, well, okay, Australia's emissions profile is going up. Again, both sides of Parliament have agreed to a target. We've got to reach there. So how many emissions do we have to stop to get there? And what's the most efficient way to do it? And so they sat there and came up with that threshold to say, well, okay, it's the least number of businesses impacted as possible to give us the biggest bang for the buck. Basically, so they're the big, and they're the easy to monitor, relatively easy to monitor ones. They're power stations. You can measure how much coal's going in the bottom and how much gas is going out the chimney. When you think about agricultural production, you know, there's thousands and thousands and thousands across the country, and they're all different. And they're not just all different from each other. Like what you do today is so different to what you do tomorrow, and next year and next year. So imagine trying to manage that. How do you even decide what your emissions are? I've got 20,000 head today, but there's a drought, so next week I'm down to 5. You know? So these liable entities are the ones that have to offset their emissions, reduce them, or buy Australian government permits. That's the tax. That's what this thing is. It started the 1st of July and it's set at $23 a tonne of CO2 equivalent. It goes up each year, and I'll show you by how much. Now that actually relates to the CFI, even though they're different. Now the CFI, so CEF stands for Clean Energy Future. CFI, Carbon Farming Initiative. This thing actually gives you guys the ability to generate credits. So in the EU system, people don't generate credits, polluters just buy permits. Whereas here they've said, hang on a tick, Australia is a largely agricultural nation. There's an opportunity here for land management to actually sequester carbon or to reduce emissions that you should be able to benefit from. So you can generate credits and sell them to those liable entities. So you've got the opportunity to make a bit of money out of it. Now, an important thing about the CFI, this is a compliance scheme. Those liable entities don't have a choice. Here, the CFI, you have a choice. It's not compulsory to participate in the CFI. You have to decide, you look at your business models, you look at the work you want to do, the risk you want to take, the return, you know, the lifestyle you want, whatever. All the things that you consider to make a decision, and you decide whether you're going to participate in the CFI or not. And you don't have to sign up today or tomorrow or next year or whenever. It's just your call. It's like deciding to grow sheep or cows. In the CFI, you can create what's called a Kyoto or a non-Kyoto ACCU. Now these terms are interchangeable, so Kyoto is interchangeable with compliant. And most people have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. There's a whole sector of rules around what can generate a carbon credit and whether it's Kyoto compliant. So a liable entity needs to buy a compliant ACCU. Non-Kyoto are voluntary or non-compliant. They all mean the same thing. So I'll try and talk about compliant credits and non-compliant credits or voluntary credits. But I do slip back into Kyoto and non-Kyoto every now and then. The best example of voluntary ones is like when you book an airline flight on the internet. Anyone done that recently? And there's a little ticker box there that you can offset your emissions. So compliance ones, they buy them because they have to. Voluntary ones, people buy them for a whole range of reasons. But because they don't have to, they're generally worth less. Where these two combine gives you into the future what we'll move through to a full emissions trading scheme. So at the moment we have the Clean Energy Future program and we have a restricted scheme. The full emissions trading scheme obviously is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've got targets that we need to reach to prevent global warming. The other parts are around getting good biodiversity outcomes, getting good land management outcomes. And the carbon farming initiative is actually designed to make sure we get things like regional social benefits and improved productivity. And I'll explain why. So that's why I keep saying there's carbon, but there's other values and other outcomes that you've got to actually base your decisions on as well. Main points. What this slide points out is the current Australian government programs. So you've got the Carbon Farming Initiative over here we've just talked about, the Clean Energy Future we've just talked about. There's a whole heap of sectors, you hear about them on the news. The carbon pricing mechanism is the tax. Renewable Energy Fund, where they're trying to increase renewable energy uptake. Energy efficiency is where they do things like support more energy efficient motors going into abattoirs or helping, that sort of stuff. Land sector package is the thing that matters to us. This is really significant. This one's a biggie, Biodiversity Fund, $946 million. Now it's a biodiversity fund. You can read into that, it's a land management fund. They were paying for things like, in the first round, weed control, fencing, erosion management, fire management, all the sort of stuff that you guys need to do on a daily basis. They're going to do calls for that over a 6-year period. They put them out every now and then. They've just put another one out. This Carbon Farming Initiative non-Kyoto fund is really important. So we talked about compliance credits and voluntary credits. Compliance credits are going to have a market. Those liable entities are going to buy them. Voluntary credits aren't going to be worth as much. So the Australian government's going to stimulate that market. They're going to put $250 million in there to buy voluntary credits. 250 million. So they're still trying to work out the exact way they're doing that, and they've had guidelines out for consultation and that sort of stuff. But that'll be very significant potentially for the rangelands, because a lot of the credits that we'll have the chance to produce will probably be voluntary credits. The other one that's important, the rest of this scheme is actually about how you establish it. So you need science, and so there's filling the research gap. You need methodologies, and I'll explain what they are. There's extension and outreach so that people can come out and actually explain what's going on and you can get the support you need. But action on the ground is where they're paying for demonstration projects. So if you want to run a project and you've got a methodology, you could apply to action on the ground and actually run a demonstration project. And they want to set those up across the country so people can actually get a bit of a hands-on feel for what it means. But that's how the Australian government programs fit together. This is how the carbon tax works. So you were talking about businesses before. These things are all important so you can make your own decisions when we start talking about projects. So what they've done, from the 1st of July it started, they set a permit price of $23. So a permit is different to a carbon credit. You can generate carbon credits, the Australian government can print permits. So a permit is $23 in this first financial year, and we know it's going to be $24.15 next financial year and $25.40 the financial year after that. So these companies that are emitting need to go and buy a permit. Now in the first 3 years, they can actually use Australian carbon credit units to offset their emissions, but only up to 5%. Now there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the Australian government needs this money because that money is what's paying for that $6 billion for Biodiversity Fund and all those millions of dollars in the program. This is supposed to be a cost neutral program, so they need to sell the permit so they get the money to run the program. But the other reason is because there's just not that many carbon credit units around. This thing's only just started. Landholders can't sort of spring them up out of the ground automatically. The first ones were around landfill sites, and now there has been a piggery waste project started as well. But the landfill, people have been capping and piping landfills for quite a while under some previous schemes, so they were able to get credits pretty quickly and get them into the market. In this period, they've got 3 choices: buy a permit, reduce their emissions, or buy a credit. If a permit costs you 23 bucks a tonne and they can reduce their emissions for less than that, they'll probably reduce their emissions. You know, if they can put in some piece of technology that reduces their emissions for less than $23 a tonne, they'll probably do that. The same for a credit. If they can buy a credit for less than that, who knows, they'll probably do that. They'll have some other drivers, but once you get past the end of 2014, this fixed price period stops and we get to a flexible price period. And the idea is that we gradually move into a full market. They don't want to create price shocks, or they don't want people collapsing by just saying, right, it all starts tomorrow. They're trying to step people into it with varying levels of security. So in the flexible price period, they'll still have permits available because there won't be enough credits. Companies will have to buy those permits, but the price is not known yet, and the price will be set a year out. These are all important because it means this is what's going to impact on the price that you might get for an Australian carbon credit unit if you decide to produce them. In this period also, we start to link internationally. So in this period, they can use offset up to 50% of their emissions by buying credits from the EU, by buying permits, sorry, from the EU. So they can then go and buy these international credits and use those to offset their emissions. But in this period, they can also use up to 100% of Australian carbon credit units. So if they can buy these for cheaper than they can buy a permit from the Australian government, they'll buy as many of them as they can get. Now, we all know that so the credit is the product that you can purchase. This creates the demand side of it, and we know that simple economics is all about supply and demand. If you look at those big emitters, the Australian government's estimated that in the first 3-year period, we're going to need somewhere between 300 and 350 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent permits or offsets, credits. 300 to 350 million. Now, they've also worked out that, sorry, I'll go back a step. So if they can offset by 5% ACCUs, that means we need 15 to 17.5 million credits to fully fulfil that up to 5% limit. Now, they've worked out, or they estimate, that we'll produce somewhere between 5 and 16 million by 2020. So that's not even on the scale. You do get to full linking. You can export Australian carbon credit units. We will get to the point where you can export Australian permits. So although we don't have a global market, that sort of linking is what will develop that. Now, it's really important in simple terms because although the tax is separate from the Carbon Farming Initiative, demand, and you guys, the CFI, supply. So how you actually generate Australian carbon credit unit, how do you actually get into this game? And so we talked about compliance and voluntary, the differences there. Compliance are worth more, voluntary are worth less. There's then two distinct types of projects. One of them is emissions avoidance. That's where you stop emissions going into the atmosphere. So you make your herd more efficient, or you cover the sewerage ponds at the dairy or the piggery or the landfill. The other project type is sequestration, and that's where you're actually taking the gases out of the atmosphere and storing it. So you've got two options: stopping producing them or taking them out of the atmosphere and storing it. And these are two things that you guys actually do fairly regularly anyway. It's just not necessarily generating a carbon credit. So the sorts of things that we talk about that you can do: methane from manure, we've talked about that one. What they call reduced enteric fermentation in livestock, and that's about reducing your emissions per kilo turned off. So getting your herd to be more methane efficient. Nitrification inhibitors, that's a little bit further down the track. Savanna fire management is one that's actually out there and operating now. And that's about changing, and it's only in the top end at the moment. The science is only there for the 1,000 mil rainfall and above. But that's about changing from late dry season burns, big hot fires that emit lots of gases, to early dry season burns, which are smaller, cooler fires that emit less gas. And you can claim the difference. The carbon sequestration one gets a little bit more complicated. They're reasonably straightforward. The storage one gets a bit more complicated because there's all these rules around what vegetation is what, and whether it becomes Kyoto compliant or non-Kyoto compliant, voluntary. And it's got to be Kyoto compliant vegetation is a Kyoto forest. You might have thought you knew what a forest is, but it's defined quite clearly. It's got to reach greater than 2 metres height, have 20% canopy cover, and cover more than 2 hectares. Everything else is non-Kyoto. So in the rangeland, some of our sort of Gidgee and Mulga regrowth areas would fill that need. When you look at the sort of fantastic grasslands that you've got out here, obviously not Kyoto. And that's why I was saying before that the voluntary stuff is going to be really important for us potentially. You then have rules around whether it's avoided deforestation, so it's forest that you could legally clear, but you don't. Whether it's reforestation, so there was forest there that had been cleared and you bring it back, or afforestation. There wasn't forest there to start with, but you create one. This one up the top then is a methodology that's out there now, and that's human-induced regeneration. So you're not going out putting in plants and seedlings and all that sort of stuff, you're actually just letting it regenerate or doing something to help it regenerate. And so that sort of stuff is where you're talking about, you know, white on a PMAV in your property vegetation, where you can go through and clear it repeatedly. Well, you can actually cause that regeneration to occur by not clearing it and potentially generate a carbon credit. So they're the differences. So you've straight away thought, hang on a tick, I'm storing this carbon in the landscape, be it in vegetation or soils. That means it's got to stay in the landscape, right? And there's this thing called permanence, which means it's actually got to stay there for 100 years. Now, because obviously emissions avoidance, you've stopped it going, it doesn't have that permanence. Like you've stopped it, you can't suddenly make it come back again. But for the sequestration, it has to be there for 100 years. Getting back to this, the other important thing in carbon sequestration, we talked about trees and vegetation and stuff, increasing soil carbon. Soil carbon gets a lot of airplay, and so that's actually a voluntary credit, so therefore not worth as much, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Native veg, you can see here non-forest revegetation, native veg on non-deforested land, that's us. That's rangeland stuff.